What if history wasn't chaos, but choreography? What if royal lives, spanning centuries, continents and bloodlines, kept tripping over the same names, same dates, same strange endings? From ghostly coronations to cursed birthdays, welcome to a world where the British monarchy's most baffling moments aren't just mysterious, they're repeated. This isn't just about power, it's about patterns. 53 of them. Coincidences so eerie, you'll start wondering whether the crown comes with a script. This is 53 Strangest British Royal Coincidences, and nothing here happens just once. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed, because if history loves patterns, you'll want to catch the next twist before it repeats. And hey, while you're here, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Sydney? I want to know who's out there unraveling royal mysteries with me. 1. The two Umbertos. It begins, as so many royal stories do, with a lunch. Not a coronation, not a declaration of war, just lunch in Monza, Italy, in the summer of 1900. King Umberto I, sovereign of Italy, steps into a small, unremarkable restaurant. The air is warm, the tablecloths are crisp, and the proprietor, summoned to greet the monarch, walks out, only for the room to fall still, because standing across from the king is the king, or rather, a man who looks precisely like him. Same moustache, same eyes, same regal tilt of the jaw. Not just lookalikes, doubles to the point of farce. And it gets worse. This man, the owner, is also named Umberto, born on the exact same day as the king, in the same city, Turin. Both men married women named Margherita, both on the same day. Their careers, king and restaurateur, admittedly not mirror professions, but still each began his respective work on the same day. And now here they are, colliding in a diner like two timelines, forgetting who's real. A journalist who later heard the story asked the obvious question: "Are you sure it wasn't just the king talking to a mirror?" No one laughed, because the mirror cracked the next day. On July 29, 1900, the very next day after their doppelganger lunch, the restaurateur was shot and killed under mysterious circumstances. And just hours later, in a completely separate attack, King Umberto I was assassinated by an anarchist named Gaetano Bresci. The two Umbertos, same life, same date, same name, and then just like that, the same ending. Now you could say strange coincidences happen. Perhaps even a handful of overlapping details between two men born in the same city on the same day. But then the deaths, the assassinations within hours, it pushes past probability. It begins to read like a cosmic glitch, or maybe a cruelly over-designed joke. Of course, history doesn't tell us if they talked long, whether the king asked the man if he ever felt watched, or if the restaurateur wondered aloud whether their lives were being written by the same lazy hand. No answers, just symmetry. And that symmetry, that almost vindictive repetition, will come back again and again, sometimes across bloodlines, sometimes across centuries, sometimes with kings, sometimes with shadows, sometimes with a comet. 2. Halley's comet on a king's crown. Tigranes II of Armenia was not a man given to understatement. His empire, in the 1st century BC, stretched from the Mediterranean to the Caspian. His armies moved like ink across a map. His enemies, well, they didn't last long enough to be enemies for very long, so it makes a kind of sense that his crown would be ostentatious, a high tiara covered in stars. But one star was different, longer, trailing, curved like a flame. Scholars now look at that coin, minted around 87 BC, and whisper the name Halley. Yes, that Halley, the comet, the interstellar ice rock that swings by Earth every 75 or so years to remind us how small our dramas are. The thing is, Halley's comet did appear right around then, 87 BC, give or take a year, depending on which historian you annoy. And there, perched in silver on Tigranes' crown, is a clear, stylized tail, not a sunburst, not a ray, not a symbolic gesture, a comet. The oldest known depiction of Halley's Comet might be sitting not in a science text or a telescope sketchbook, but on the literal headgear of a king. Now, in fairness, Tigranes probably wasn't trying to document astrophysical phenomena. More likely, he saw a streak across the sky and thought, "Good, that's mine now." Kings have always had a strange relationship with the sky. Omens, stars, eclipses, celestial narcissism. But if you zoom out, really zoom out, the comet didn't just pass above his crown, it passed through history. Because Halley's Comet also appeared in 1066, just before the Norman conquest. It appeared before Mark Twain was born, and again when he died. It showed up near the death of Genghis Khan, and centuries later over the trenches of World War I. It seems to like transitions. Or perhaps it simply highlights them. A streak of fire reminding us that no king, no matter how jeweled his tiara, can hold back the night. Was it coincidence that Tigranes crowned himself king just after the comet appeared? Was he drawing from the sky to anoint himself chosen by fate? Or was it the opposite? Was the comet a warning, and he just didn't read it right? We don't know, but we do know this. His empire fell, and his image remains. A man who wore a comet on his head, as if daring the sky to strike him down. Spoiler, it eventually did. And just as kings wore stars on their brows, others mirrored each other in marriages. Not celestial echoes, but very human ones. Veils, bells, and ghosts of other weddings already held. Strange, isn't it? A king crowned with a comet blazing overhead, like the sky itself signing the decree. And we're only getting started. If this kind of mystery keeps you up at night, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss the next echo in the royal timeline. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Let's see who else is unraveling history in the dark with us. 3. Parallel marriages of French and Scottish royals. It's a strange thing to marry a stranger for political gain and then accidentally end up mimicking your descendants. In 1537, James V of Scotland married Madeleine of Valois. It was a delicate match. The French princess was young, frail, and not built for the Scottish climate, which at the time was mostly composed of mist, thistles, and conspiracy. The celebrations, though, were lavish. French courts painted with tartans, the wine flowed, the marriage was brief, Madeleine died mere months later, but it left an aesthetic impression. Then, in 1558, history repeated. Another Scottish royal, another French union. This time, Mary, Queen of Scots, James and Madeleine's daughter, married the Dauphin of France. The parallels were eerie. The feasts mirrored those of her parents, down to the decor. The music, the tone, even the speeches were oddly similar. It was as if the court had simply recycled the wedding script from 2 decades earlier, and in a way it had. The same families, the same alliance, the same underlying desperation to unite Scotland and France in a world increasingly dominated by England. But here's where it gets weird. The earlier wedding had ended in death, so did this one. Mary's husband too died young, and the union, like before, dissolved not in scandal but in tragedy. The parallel didn't just extend to the celebration, it stretched through the entire arc. Some saw it as a romantic echo, others called it a curse, a generational reenactment dressed up in lace and diplomacy. But whichever it was, it established a strange pattern in the royal psyche, that marriages weren't just alliances, they were reflections. Sometimes of ancestors, sometimes of doomed futures, because when royals marry, they don't just inherit titles, they inherit patterns. And sometimes the past walks down the aisle with them, smiling in the crowd. But patterns aren't just in weddings. Sometimes they're in faces, in bone structures, in tall, towering queens who seem strangely familiar. 4. 2 queens, Mary, same height. History remembers them as very different women. One was Catholic royalty drenched in blood and suspicion. The other, a Protestant co-monarch ruling alongside her husband. One died young and tragic in a foreign land. The other died older, steadier, enshrined in a quiet Protestant order. But if you strip away religion, politics, and several centuries of propaganda, two odd details remain. Both were named Mary, and both apparently were tall, toweringly so. Mary, Queen of Scots, the more tragic of the two, was often described as strikingly tall for her time. Reports say she stood around 5 feet 11 inches, a height that made her loom quite literally over most men of her era. She was long-limbed, elegant, with a swan-like neck and a regal bearing that probably terrified as many as it enchanted. Fast forward more than a century, and you arrive at Mary II of England, daughter of James II, wife of William of Orange. She too is believed to have been tall, with some accounts once again placing her around the same 5 feet 11 inches, although this could be exaggerated court flattery or a statistical fluke. Now, in isolation, two tall women named Mary doesn't seem remarkable. But these weren't ordinary women. These were queens, in a time when height, especially for women, was rare, conspicuous, and politically symbolic. To be that tall was to be seen, in portraits, in parades, in court appearances. They both stood out, even when surrounded by peacocks and powdered wigs. And then there's the mirroring. Mary of Scots was Queen Consort of France, then Queen Regent of Scotland. Mary II was co-monarch of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Both were caught in the crosshairs of dynastic struggle. One was executed, the other outlived her crisis, but only barely, dying young from smallpox, leaving no children. And both are remembered less for what they did than for how they looked. Beautiful, imposing, dignified, tragic. Is it mere coincidence that both queens named Mary, born into royal chaos, were unusually tall and defined by the way they navigated male power structures? Maybe, but the physical detail clings to the legend, as if history itself can't quite let it go. Height, after all, is not just a biological accident. In monarchies, it becomes myth. Alexander the Great was said to be short, so artists lengthened his legs. Henry VIII wore platform shoes. Louis XIV demanded special boots to appear taller than his guards. In a world where stature equaled sovereignty, being tall wasn't just noticeable, it was narrative. So when you get two Marys, both queens, both tall, both draped in tragedy, well, you start to wonder whether history is glitching again, replaying the same archetype, as if the name Mary came with a specific silhouette already built in. Of course, height alone isn't a mystery, but what happens when you combine it with language, with a royal who, despite every reason not to, decides to speak the tongue of her people even when her people weren't really her own? 5. Queen who learned the native tongue. When Cleopatra VII took the throne of Egypt, she inherited a dynasty, a nation, and a very awkward linguistic situation. Her family, the Ptolemies, had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries by then. They were Greek, Macedonian Greek technically, but still very much foreign, in blood, culture, and language. They didn't bother learning the Egyptian tongue. They ruled from Alexandria, built temples to Greek gods, and essentially treated Egypt as a very warm Mediterranean estate with pyramids for decor. But Cleopatra was different. Somewhere between her alliances with Rome, her brutal family politics, and her flair for drama, she made a strange and strangely overlooked choice. She learned to speak Egyptian. Let that land for a second. She was the only Ptolemaic ruler in over 250 years to do so. Everyone else spoke Greek and let the priests do the local PR. But Cleopatra, she spoke to her people in their own tongue, addressed crowds, held ceremonies, even named herself in pharaonic style. It was less about assimilation and more about mastery, the act of stepping into a world she was not born into and commanding it from within. Some historians chalk this up to political savvy. Egypt was fracturing under internal pressures and Roman manipulation. Cleopatra needed to rally support. Speaking Egyptian made her seem more legitimate, more divine. After all, pharaohs were supposed to be gods, and gods ideally shouldn't need a translator. But there's something deeper here, something oddly emotional. She didn't have to learn the language. No one expected her to. Doing so was in some ways a break from her own royal identity, a symbolic betrayal of the Greek dynasty she descended from. And yet she did it anyway, not because it was required, because it meant something. How many monarchs throughout history have ruled lands they could not linguistically enter? Countless, from English kings who didn't speak English for generations to European royals married into foreign courts who never bothered to learn the local dialect. Cleopatra defied that pattern, and in doing so, she became a sort of living contradiction, both foreign and native, both occupier and avatar of the people. Her legend was built not just on beauty or seduction, but on speech, the ability to speak both literally and metaphorically across divides. And maybe that's why she's remembered so vividly. Not just for her alliances or her death, but for that odd little act of linguistic rebellion, a queen speaking a language her ancestors had considered beneath them. It wasn't the first time royal identity would hinge on a subtle gesture, but it would echo, and echoes have a habit of repeating, especially when names and death dates start lining up in patterns no one designed. 6. Repeated royal names and death dates. There are only so many royal names. That's not a coincidence. It's branding. You can't have a King Gary or Queen Tiffany. Instead, dynasties echo themselves across generations. Henry, Charles, Edward, Mary, Elizabeth, George, like a greatest hits playlist stuck on repeat. But sometimes those names do more than just recur. Sometimes they start dying on the same day. This is where royal genealogists start rubbing their temples, because there are odd instances, scattered, quiet but unsettling, where kings or queens sharing a name die on the exact same calendar date. Not the same year, of course, but the same day and month. Henry IV and Henry VI, Charles I and Charles XII. Sometimes it's a stretch, sometimes it's not. Now, most royal houses kept meticulous records of births, deaths, and coronations, not because they were sentimental, but because timing was power. But buried in those records are these eerie alignments, royal deaths clustering on a certain day, the same name, the same dynasty, the same ending centuries apart. Some chalk it up to statistical noise. After all, there are only 365 days and a few dozen royal names. Patterns are inevitable, right? Except this isn't just one house. The Tudors had it, the Stuarts had it, the Habsburgs, the Capetians, the Romanovs. You can find death date alignments like weeds in royal gardens, and the more you look, the weirder it gets. Kings with the same name dying in the same castle on the same date, sometimes even under similar circumstances, illness, battle, sudden collapse. No official historian will claim causality. That would be madness. But even the driest record keepers sometimes make margin notes, same date as King X, as if they too felt a chill while writing it down. Of course, there's no royal memo dictating these repetitions, no celestial schedule, but the pattern persists, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. And if names and dates can repeat, what else can? Illness? Accidents? Inheritances of fate? Or perhaps even something darker, like death itself stalking a family line, waiting patiently for the right day to strike again. 7. Two princes dying in the same way. In the great royal houses of Europe, death rarely arrives gently. It has a flair for timing, a taste for irony, and an appetite for repetition. Sometimes it returns not just to the same bloodline, but with the same script. A prince is born, groomed, promised the crown, and then vanishes in the same grim way a predecessor once did, centuries apart. Different courts, same ending. There are multiple cases. Different countries, different names. A Habsburg prince succumbing to smallpox in the 18th century, followed decades later by another royal heir, same family, falling to the same disease despite advances in medicine. In England, a Tudor prince felled by what was called the sweating sickness, and in the next century, a Stuart heir collapsing under nearly identical symptoms. French heirs quietly wasting away in towers, or Austrian archdukes struck down by infections that statistically shouldn't have hit royalty twice in the same way. It's the symmetry that haunts. In dynasties where every move is calculated, how can death be so deliberate? Even when the causes differ on paper, the echoes ring loud. A prince falls ill after a diplomatic trip. Decades later, another prince, same title, falls ill after a similar visit abroad. A crown passed from father to son becomes instead a grave passed from prince to prince. The modern mind wants to ask, were there genetic links? Haemophilia, tuberculosis, inherited weakness? Yes, perhaps, but even genetics doesn't explain timing. Why anniversaries of deaths repeat? Why siblings in different generations fall at the same age, in the same way, sometimes in the same palace. It's the quiet kind of tragedy, the kind royal families never talk about. A palace mourning veil reused, a funeral procession eerily similar to one archived decades earlier. The public hears the official story, the court hears the echoes, and for those watching the line of succession, it always leaves a trace of dread. A sense that the path to the throne might carry the same pitfalls as before, that being next in line may also mean next in fate, because in royal history, death doesn't just haunt corridors. Sometimes it has a favorite room, but the pattern doesn't stop at cause of death. In some dynasties, it zooms out, repeating in dates, calendar dates that won't let go. 8. Dynastic mirror deaths. The calendar is a cruel historian. It remembers everything even when no one asks it to, especially when it comes to royalty. In some dynasties, a quiet but chilling pattern appears. A king dies on a certain day, and centuries later, another king from the same lineage dies on that very same date. Not a birthday, not a coronation, not a planned observance, just the same day for dying. You'd expect royal deaths to be scattered across history like random stars, scattered, unpredictable, tragic. But instead, these eerie alignments keep surfacing. An English king who dies on November 6th. A later monarch, same house, also falls on November 6th. It's often written off as nothing, coincidence. After all, royal lives are long, royal calendars are dense. Dates repeat, don't they? And yet, these aren't just overlaps, they're often quiet tributes to catastrophe. Sometimes the same palace, sometimes the same illness, sometimes the same chair. Chroniclers occasionally noted the strange symmetry, but they rarely dwelled on it. After all, monarchies are built on the illusion of control, and nothing mocks that illusion more than death arriving with a sense of déjà vu. Take the House of Bourbon, or the Habsburgs, or even the Windsors. Each has had monarchs or heirs die on the same calendar date across generations, not as victims of assassination or war, but through illness, collapse, or eerie coincidence. The press will say heart failure or complications. The archives will note the time of death, but what they don't say, at least not officially, is this date again. To the outside world, it's just an odd footnote. To the families involved, it's a ticking clock. Some royals even avoid public appearances on dates that have become unofficially unlucky. Some palace staff members know which days not to schedule a ceremony. No one wants to say the word curse, but no one's exactly calling it a coincidence either. In the end, the calendar doesn't lie, and when it starts circling back, date by date, life by life, you begin to see it for what it is. A loop. A quiet echo in a marble hallway. But sometimes the echo gets louder, especially when a king and his rival, his living opposite, are marked by the same day. 9. King and Pretender. Share name, Death Day. The crown attracts many things: power, envy, ambition, and shadows. Among those shadows, none are more persistent than pretenders. Those would-be kings, rival claimants, exiled cousins, and long-lost sons who claim the throne was meant for them. Normally, a king's name is his alone, his reign defines it, but sometimes, eerily, his name belongs to another. And sometimes, just sometimes, they die on the same day. Imagine this: a reigning monarch named William, a rival claimant, also William, exiled or imprisoned or hiding in plain sight. They share a name by chance or perhaps by calculated ambition. Their lives move on separate tracks, one ruling, the other scheming or simply surviving. But then history folds, the monarch dies, and on the very same date, in a different year, the pretender dies too. It's not the kind of detail that makes official biographies, but it shows up in family trees, in archived obituaries. Two men, same name, same date of death, one with a crown, one without. You could almost hear the universe whispering, only one William per calendar. There are scattered records, sometimes well documented, sometimes just whispers in footnotes. A deposed claimant dying quietly in a monastery on the same date the monarch who exiled him died decades before. A rebel general sharing a name with the king he tried to replace, both dead on March 17th, years apart. In most cases, it's impossible to tell whether these men even knew of the pattern, whether the pretender in his final days looked up and said, "Ah, today," or whether the royal family noticed at all, or deliberately ignored it. Still, there's something grimly symmetrical about it, as if history demands balance, as if the name cannot be spoken without a matched end. One ruled, one dreamed of ruling, but in the ledger of death they are equals. It's not just poetic justice, it's mathematical tragedy. The kind of thing you can't plan, you can only record. And perhaps that's the point. In the long game of monarchy, there's only room for so many names, and when one dies, the echo, the pretender, the shadow, isn't far behind. But sometimes it doesn't even take a shadow. Sometimes the strangeness comes in pairs, born together, looking alike, and reappearing across generations like a hereditary glitch. 10. Royal twins reappearing. Twins are rare in royal history, and when they do arrive, they cause confusion, not just in the line of succession, but in legend, because twin births in monarchies feel symbolic, mythic even. Double heirs, double destinies, the potential for one crown to split in two. And when the pattern repeats, not once, but centuries later, it starts to feel like something more than coincidence. Consider a royal house where twin sons are born in one generation, only to have another pair appear generations later. Same family, same gender, same dynamic. The odds are already long, but history doesn't care about odds, it cares about stories. In the 15th century, for instance, a European royal dynasty documented the birth of twin princes, one stronger, one frailer. The stronger was groomed for power, while the weaker was quietly set aside. As always with monarchy, symmetry isn't fairness. Fast forward centuries later, and the same family line records another twin birth. Once again, one child is hailed as robust, promising, kingly. The other, curiously kept from view. Some historians roll their eyes at this kind of anecdote. Twins happen, bloodlines are long, repetition is bound to occur, but what unsettles people isn't just the biology, it's the repetition of roles. One heir, one shadow, one beloved, one forgotten. Two births, one path to power. And the symbolism practically writes itself. In many ancient cultures, twins were seen as omens of unity, of balance, of catastrophe. Romulus and Remus, Castor and Pollux, one always seems to die or vanish or fall behind. So when royal houses begin to echo this motif over centuries, it feels less like chance and more like theatre. There are also strange reports, half buried in genealogies, of twin names repeating too. The same pair of names given centuries apart, sometimes explained as homage, sometimes as oversight. But it raises an odd question. Is the second set of twins just echoing the first? Or does something in the family tree recur? Royal lines, after all, aren't just built on succession. They're built on patterns, and when those patterns double across time, they're hard to ignore. Of course, the most unnerving twin pattern isn't birth, it's conflict, when brothers face each other not in cribs, but on thrones. 11. Monarchs born same day, opposed later. In the vast mess of royal calendars, it's easy to find birth dates that overlap. Monarchs are born all the time, but when two rulers from different countries are born on the same day, only to later become bitter rivals on the battlefield or the negotiating table, it starts to feel like the stars have a sense of humor. Imagine this: two babies born the same day, in palaces hundreds of miles apart, one in France, one in England, or one in Russia, the other in Prussia, both wrapped in silk, both hailed as saviors of their nations. None of their nurses thinking, "Ah, yes, this one will someday try to kill the other," and yet they do. You'll find cases where rulers born on the exact same day, say September 5th, would grow up, rise to power, and become each other's defining nemesis. Not mere political sparring partners, but full-blown historical foils. Napoleon and Wellington weren't born on the same day, but there are others who were. Less famous, perhaps, but no less entangled. It's a calendar twist that begs for interpretation. Are these coincidences or cosmic jokes? Born under the same stars, perhaps sharing the same fates, only to become the sharpest thorns in each other's lives. Astrologers of the time certainly thought it meant something. Rival horoscopes were drawn up and compared, Mars in opposition, Saturn in retrograde, as if anyone could chart out a lifetime of imperial rivalry from a handful of constellations. But even skeptics admit it's strange. These weren't men whose lives happened to cross. Their entire arcs seem designed to collide. Their birthdays, their ages, their policies, all uncannily aligned. And in some cases, the symmetry deepens. They die around the same time, or are deposed within the same year. Their portraits painted with similar poses. Even their funerals echo each other. Same ceremonial colors, same public unrest. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes the shared birthday is a footnote, but sometimes it becomes a mirror, one that reflects not just a man, but his equal and opposite. Because in royal history, it's not just about who was born. It's about who else was born on the same day, and what that pairing might mean. And if those alignments are strange, wait until you see what happens when their lives or deaths link through numbers. 12. Regnal years, matching birth years. Royal numbers are everywhere. Birth dates, death dates, reign lengths, coronation years, Jubilee anniversaries. It's a tapestry of dates and digits that historians love to chart and spreadsheet, but every so often a bizarre number match appears. A monarch begins their reign in a year that perfectly matches the birth year of another, sometimes a later king or queen. For example, King A begins his reign in the year 1760. Decades later, King B is born in 1760. The overlap seems arbitrary, but then it keeps happening. You begin to notice how certain dates refuse to leave the royal timeline. The same year crops up again and again, not just in events, but in identities. Regnal years, the official starting points of a monarch's rule, matching precisely with the births or deaths of other rulers, either within the same dynasty or across borders. It's easy to dismiss, after all, numbers do repeat, but when these aligned years also mark turning points in royal history, they start to look suspiciously deliberate. A king dies in 1837, another begins to reign in 1837, a future queen is born in 1837. 3 arcs, beginning, middle and end, looping through the same digits. It's the kind of numerical overlap that doesn't prove anything, but hints at something, a shadow structure beneath history, an invisible symmetry playing out behind the scenes. Some amateur historians get carried away. They build theories of numerology, suggesting that certain years are royal years, fated to carry birth or death or coronation. Others remain skeptical, chalking it all up to the law of large numbers. After all, when you're dealing with centuries of monarchs, some years are bound to carry more weight. But still, even among the skeptics, there's an unease, a sense that these dates are more than timestamps. They're markers, signposts in the strange continuity of monarchy, where one reign's beginning dovetails with another's birth. And if reigns can echo births, what else can overlap? like two coronations, same date, different centuries. A strange moment when two rulers step into power under the same sun. 13. Shared coronation dates. Coronations are meant to be singular. One day, one monarch, one spectacle, the air thick with incense and symbolic destiny. Yet now and then, buried in the overlapping centuries of royal record-keeping, something peculiar happens. Two monarchs, sometimes centuries apart, sometimes in different countries, end up crowned on the exact same calendar day. Not the same year, not even the same location, just the same date, say June the 1st, echoing like a bell through time. It might not seem meaningful at first. After all, how many auspicious days are there on a medieval calendar? And yet, coronations are not randomly chosen. They are meticulously planned. Astrologers consulted, clergy scheduled, politics accounted for. So when one monarch is crowned on a date previously used by another, and especially when they're from the same bloodline, it raises eyebrows. Take, for example, two rulers from the same dynasty, both ascending to power on May the 12th. No intentional tribute, no known reason, but there it is, the same date inked onto the timeline, centuries apart. Sometimes it's discovered only later by bored historians or genealogists looking for patterns where there shouldn't be any. Occasionally this repetition becomes part of the law, a date chosen on purpose to invoke continuity or legitimacy. A second Elizabeth crowned on the same date as a previous queen, not by coincidence but by design. Yet sometimes it's the opposite. The coronation date seems to echo the past unintentionally, like a glitch no one noticed until it was too late. And here's the twist. Some of these shared dates are marked not by triumph, but by tragedy. A king crowned on the same date another once was, only to be deposed or assassinated or remembered for catastrophe. A coronation date reused only to become cursed. It's a reminder that time is not as linear as we'd like it to be. That the rituals meant to set monarchs apart can also bind them together, through numbers, through patterns, through shared fates. And if a date can return like that, what about a name? What happens when a name thought long buried finds its way back to the throne? 14. Return of a deposed king's name. Monarchies are allergic to certain names. After a particularly disastrous reign, a royal name can vanish from the lineage for centuries, blacklisted by history, too politically radioactive to reuse. But names have a funny way of returning, like ghosts in full regalia. Take a king named Richard. After a scandalous fall, exile, or violent end, the name quietly disappears from royal nurseries. Future monarchs avoid it. Courtiers wince when it comes up. Portraits are moved to less prominent halls. For a while, the name is a cautionary tale, and then, out of nowhere, it's back. A new prince is born. A queen mother insists on tradition. A distant ancestor is romanticized. Suddenly, the cursed name is spoken again, not with fear, but with pride. And when the child grows, and perhaps even inherits a throne, that name takes on new meaning, a reclamation, a resurrection. But here's where the pattern gets strange. The revived name often brings a strangely familiar fate. A monarch named after a deposed king may rule in uncertain times, may face the same constitutional dilemmas, the same political fractures. Occasionally, and this is where it tips from poetic to unsettling, the same end. Historians disagree on whether this is mere superstition, but the pattern's there. The name disappears after disgrace, returns generations later, and when it does, things get shaky. It's almost as if the name never quite left, just waited, in the margins of dusty scrolls and half-forgotten hymns, lingering in the bloodline, a royal palindrome, doomed to read the same backward as forward. And names once revived don't come back alone. They tend to bring old energies with them, old curses, old patterns. The throne might be new, the face young, but the name knows its way around the palace. And while some kings revive a name, others find themselves bound by dates, even in their dying breath. Because when you host a feast in a palace, you don't expect it to be your last, until it is, just like the last time. 15. Death at the same banquet date. For monarchs, feasts are more than food. They are performances, rituals of abundance, unity and power, silver goblets, roasted meats, flattery served in equal portions to wine. But sometimes these royal banquets end abruptly. A king slumps in his chair, a toast unfinished, a smile frozen mid-performance, and then, centuries later, it happens again. Different monarch, different century, same date. That's the strange part. Not that kings die, they all do eventually, but that some seem to die in the exact same setting on the same day of the year. Two monarchs, separated by hundreds of years, perish during a banquet or feast on the same calendar date, say October the 10th, in grand dining halls while surrounded by celebration. The official records might chalk it up to illness or stress or one too many toasts. But privately, those close to the crown start whispering, "Didn't King X also die on this day?" And suddenly the walls of the palace feel thinner. Time collapses. The smell of roasted pheasant doesn't feel quite as appetizing. Sometimes it's the same palace, even the same banquet hall. A room designed for opulence becomes a quiet theatre for mirrored endings. After the second such death, the date is never used again. Banquets are quietly rescheduled, anniversaries renamed. History doesn't forget, but it can be politely ignored, especially when it's wearing formal wear. And yet the echo remains. Two kings, same date, same feast, same curtain call. The question isn't why it happened, it's why it happened twice. And if death can come knocking twice on a celebration, what happens when it lands on something even more personal, like your own birthday? 16. Royal disasters on birthdays. Birthdays are supposed to be safe. Even for monarchs, they're one of the few moments when power pauses for cake. It's the annual victory lap, another year on the throne, another round of loyal congratulations, another excuse to parade around with ceremonial flair. But sometimes the date of birth doesn't bring celebration. It brings ruin. Imagine a king waking up to trumpets and fanfare only to face humiliation by sundown. A major defeat in battle, a rebellion declared, a trusted advisor turning coat, and then, years later, a descendant, perhaps one who shares not just the bloodline but the birthday, suffers a similar fate. On the same calendar day, that supposed day of joy collapses into catastrophe, not once, but again. A pattern forming, quiet but persistent. You'll find whispers of this in European chronicles. Monarchs whose birthdays double as the anniversary of some calamity. Sometimes it's a defeat in war, sometimes an assassination attempt, sometimes a political betrayal so shattering it reshapes the monarchy. And then, like a cruel anniversary card, the same date comes back, this time for a son or great-grandson or distant namesake. Astrologers naturally had opinions. They'd study the king's natal chart and mutter dark things about Saturn. But even the most skeptical royal secretary might glance at the date on the morning briefing and feel a small chill. Because the thing about royalty is this: everything gets recorded. And when history starts lining up events on the same date, especially personal ones, it doesn't go unnoticed. In some royal households, birthdays once marked by parties became more subdued, sometimes skipped entirely. No banquets, no toasts, just quiet meetings and wary glances toward the calendar. And as odd as it sounds, some monarchs began to dread their own birthdays, not for fear of aging, but because their lives had shown them what else the day might bring. But while birthdays can betray, alliances, especially marital ones, can repeat, sometimes with eerie diplomatic precision. 17. Mirror marriages. Royal marriages have rarely been about love. They're chess moves in lace. When a princess from Kingdom A marries a king from Kingdom B, it's not about candlelit dinners. It's about treaties, dowries, and geography. But what happens when that exact pattern repeats? Same countries, same roles, same marriage, but centuries apart? That's when historians start talking about mirror marriages, political unions that seem to fold time in on itself. Take a princess from Portugal marrying into the English monarchy in the 17th century. She brings with her not only wealth and alliances, but also cultural influence. Think tea, orange trees, and porcelain. Then, centuries later, another Portuguese royal makes a similar match, with a strikingly parallel diplomatic backdrop. The continent in crisis, England looking for leverage, Portugal offering a bride, or look to Scandinavia, a Danish princess marrying a British heir in the 19th century, then another Danish royal years later, following nearly the same path, right down to the name. The second union even reuses some ceremonial details from the first. Coincidence? Maybe. But these mirrored marriages go beyond convenience. Often, the personalities involved also echo each other. Reserved queens, loyal but overshadowed, women who adapt to foreign courts with poise and often silence. It's as if the first marriage writes a script and the second simply rehearses it again, scene for scene. You could argue it's just dynastic recycling. Countries don't have many allies to choose from. But the pattern remains strange. Specific unions, spaced apart by generations, with near-identical stakes, outcomes, and pageantry. And when you see it once, it's curious. Twice, suspicious. By the third time, you start to wonder if these monarchies are simply trapped in a loop of treaties in wedding gowns. And if alliances can repeat like that, imagine what happens when siblings do. Brothers rising to power, clashing like reflections from different centuries. 18. Sibling pairs in different eras. Brothers in royal history rarely get along. One is born first, and with that comes the crown, or at least the expectation of it. The second is born into a different role. Backup, rival, sometimes rebel. The dynamic is ancient, biblical even, and it repeats. In some dynasties, this rivalry between brothers doesn't just happen once. It returns generations later with eerie precision. Picture this: two royal brothers in the 12th century, one crowned king, the other waging war against him. Fast forward 300 years, and you get another pair. Same titles, same house, same story. One brother's name even matches the rebel from the past, as if the family tree had hiccuped and spat out a historical reboot. And this isn't just metaphor. In the Plantagenet line, you'll find echoes of this. The Tudors, too, had their share of brotherly tension, including one crownless heir dying young, clearing the way for a more famous sibling. The Habsburgs? Don't even start. What's particularly strange is how these brother duos often mirror each other in more than just power struggles. Their personalities, their political stances, even their fates all seem to repeat. One brother ascends, rules briefly, then falters. The other rises from the shadows, sometimes as regent, sometimes as a usurper, sometimes as a tragic footnote. Coincidence? Sure, but it's uncanny how often royal history features sibling pairs who seem to be acting out inherited roles, not just by blood, but by narrative. And when the second iteration plays out, no one seems surprised. It's as if the court has seen this show before. Same plot, different century. So the next time two royal brothers appear on the historical stage, pay attention. Chances are one of them has already played the part a few hundred years ago. 19. Royal houses intersecting generations. Later, in theory, royal dynasties are straight lines. A king marries a queen, their child marries another royal. The tree grows, the crown moves along, but in practice it's more like a tangled vine, bloodlines looping, knotting and crossing over themselves until you need a map just to figure out who's technically whose cousin. And then there are the intersections, the strange moments when two royal houses, long parted by geography or politics, suddenly meet again, generations later, through marriage, diplomacy or scandal. A reunion no one planned, and yet seems almost scripted. Consider two dynasties that once forged an alliance through marriage. That bond breaks, the families drift apart, war maybe follows, centuries pass. Then a royal wedding is announced, and the bride and groom, descendants from those same old houses. The bloodlines find their way back to each other like old friends or old enemies, circling the same dance floor. In some cases, these renewed unions are diplomatic coincidences. In others, it seems like a full circle moment, a centuries later echo of a political gamble once made, lost, and now quietly restitched. Take the British and German royal houses. Interwoven once through Victoria's children, pulled apart by war, reunited later in quieter generations. Or France and Spain, whose Bourbon roots have splintered and rejoined so often that modern royals sometimes share more DNA with their former enemies than their own domestic aristocracy. The symmetry can be chilling. Sometimes the exact same royal titles, once exchanged in a 15th century treaty, resurface again on 21st century invitations. As if history never quite finishes its sentences, it just uses ellipses. And when bloodlines find each other again after so many generations apart, it raises a strange question. Do dynasties remember, or are they simply repeating shapes they can't see? Of course, some echoes aren't about who marries whom, but who shares a tombstone date. 20. Same burial day. Death has a habit of leveling royalty. No matter how grand the life, the final date gets carved into stone just the same. But now and then, those carved dates line up with unsettling symmetry. Two monarchs, different centuries, perhaps different countries, yet they are laid to rest on the exact same day of the year, say October 19th. It's not the same year, obviously, but the alignment is enough to raise eyebrows in royal archives. It might not seem like much, a scheduling fluke perhaps. After all, funeral processions and state ceremonies are shaped by tradition, calendar, and court availability. But some of these shared burial dates are more than coincidence. They sometimes follow eerily similar deaths, both sudden or both after long illnesses. Both monarchs lying in state for exactly the same number of days. Both buried with the same honours, same date, same echo. Some historians chalk it up to logistics, certain months being more burial-friendly than others. But in a few cases, the coincidence becomes law. Palace staff quietly noting it, royal watchers speculating. Was the date chosen as a tribute, or did the calendar just play its old tricks again? In royal families that track every detail, births, weddings, deaths, the repeated burial date becomes a quiet footnote, a reminder that time doesn't always move forward. Sometimes it circles back, drawing lines between names separated by centuries. And if two kings can be buried on the same date, what else might repeat? How about the names of royal twins, returning after generations as if summoned back into the family script? 21. Twin princes' names, reused names in royal families aren't just choices, they're strategies, symbols, political statements wrapped in syllables. But when you get twins, and then generations later another pair of twins with the same names, that's when things start to feel glitchy. Picture a king with twin sons, named Alexander and Leopold. It's a notable event, written into the annals, maybe even commemorated in coins or paintings. Fast forward 2 or 3 centuries, and another monarch from the same dynasty or a cadet branch announces the birth of twin boys. Their names, Alexander and Leopold. Coincidence? Maybe. A tribute? Possibly. But there are times when these name repetitions come with more than just nostalgia. The second set of twins often echoes the fate or roles of the first. One becomes prominent, the other withdrawn. One enters the church, the other the army. Or worse, one lives, the other does not. It's as if the names carry an inherited gravity, as if naming your children after historical twins somehow invokes their story all over again. Families that pride themselves on remembering history often find themselves repeating it, sometimes with eerie precision. And when the repetition is discovered, usually by some sharp-eyed genealogist digging through dusty ledgers, it becomes a minor royal curiosity, Ah yes, twins named like the ones in 1623, a strange full circle, a family photo album with matching pages centuries apart. But beyond names, there's a deeper, stranger pattern in royal history, heirs who disappear and then reappear. Sometimes with stories so perfect they feel rehearsed. 22. Disappeared heirs resurfacing. Every royal lineage has its ghosts. Heirs who vanish, whose bodies are never found, whose stories end not with funerals but with ellipses. But every so often, one of those ghosts comes back, or claims to. A boy prince disappears during a war. A young heir is declared dead during a coup. Years pass, and then someone shows up. Same name, same age, same impossible story. I am the lost heir, they say, and somehow parts of it check out. This pattern repeats across monarchies. A vanished child, a decades later claimant. Sometimes they're frauds, clever opportunists or deluded souls, but sometimes they're convincing enough to cause panic. Wars have been started over such claims, courts divided, families torn. The most famous case, probably the Dauphin of France, son of Louis XVI, believed dead in prison, only for numerous young men to emerge years later claiming to be him. Some were convincing enough to spark mass support. One even had nobles swearing allegiance again. DNA eventually disproved the claims, but not before the stories had spread across continents. The eerie part isn't just the reappearance, it's how often the details line up. The reappeared heir knows things he shouldn't, speaks the language, bears a physical resemblance, has scars or memories that match recorded accounts. In some cases, entire generations grow up believing the heir really did return, because the alternative is too painful. Better a living myth than a confirmed death. Royal families, of course, rarely welcome these revenants. They complicate succession. They raise questions no one wants to answer, but the public loves them. A vanished prince returned from the abyss. That's not history, that's prophecy. And sometimes the mystery isn't in the return, but in the confusion of identity itself, when a king stops being a king and starts being someone else entirely. 23. Royal mistaken identity. Royalty is supposed to be unmistakable, the crown, the robes, the lineage. But history is full of moments where kings and princes have either disguised themselves or been mistaken for someone else entirely. A traveling monarch decides to walk among his people incognito. It's a trope older than Shakespeare, yet occasionally real. But the stranger twist is when a king is mistaken for a commoner without trying, or a commoner is believed to be a royal. And in some dynasties, this bizarre confusion doesn't happen once, it happens again. The first case might involve a prince slipping out of court in disguise, only to be arrested by guards who don't recognize him. Centuries later, a similar tale unfolds, another royal mistaken for someone else. Perhaps he's traveling, or ill, or unshaven. A tavern owner thinks he's just another vagabond, until the royal retinue arrives to apologize and explain. These mix-ups become folklore, and sometimes they're dangerous. A mistaken identity at court could lead to duels, imprisonment, even political fallout. But what fascinates historians is the recurrence, the way mistaken identity follows some families like a hereditary joke. Even portraits sometimes add to the confusion. Artists commissioned to paint foreign royals would sometimes paint the wrong face or copy an earlier portrait, leading to generations of mislabeled likenesses. And once these stories enter the record, they echo. Remember when King so-and-so was mistaken for a thief becomes a kind of royal inside joke, until it happens again, because in monarchy, identity is currency. And when that identity slips, even for a moment, it exposes something deeper, the terrifying possibility that even a king can be mistaken for nobody. But sometimes it's not a mistake. Sometimes it's abduction, and that too has a pattern. 24. Mirrored abductions. Royal abductions are not exactly rare in history. When you put children on thrones and surround them with ambition, someone is bound to try and remove them from the board. But sometimes these kidnappings or attempted kidnappings don't stand alone. They echo. A princess is taken, centuries pass. Another princess from the same realm or bloodline vanishes on nearly the same calendar date. Different perpetrators, different politics. But the story arc? Uncomfortably familiar. The first case might involve a royal child spirited away during civil unrest, hidden in a monastery or foreign court. She returns years later, changed, scarred, legendary. Generations later, another girl, royal by blood, perhaps less directly in line, disappears under strange circumstances. Once again, political tension simmers. Once again, the calendar quietly matches. The public remembers. Didn't something like this happen before? The stories get compared, lined up, mirrored, and what started as tragedy morphs into folklore. In some cases, the resemblance is uncanny. Both abductions occurring during a succession crisis, both involving betrayal from inside the palace, both ending in unexpected returns or in unresolved absence. Historians call these echo events, not quite proof of anything, but too symmetrical to ignore. The repeated pattern of a royal girl removed from her world and folded into the realm of myth. And when you study these mirrored cases, a subtle fear emerges, that power not only attracts danger, but recycles it, that the calendar remembers better than the courtiers do. But if a kidnapped princess can vanish into history and return decades later, what happens when her whole family line is sent away, exiled not by stealth, but by decree? 25. Mirrored exiles. There's something particularly cruel about exile for royalty. Not death, not imprisonment, just distance, a slow, bitter unraveling of relevance. One day you're seated on a throne, and the next you're sipping watered wine in a borrowed villa, your titles meaningless, your portraits boxed. And it doesn't just happen once. In royal history, exiles repeat, sometimes in the same families, sometimes to the exact same places. A monarch is overthrown and sent abroad, maybe to a neutral country, a place with no stake in the conflict, where kings become house guests. Years or centuries later, another monarch from the same dynasty ends up exiled to the same region, the same villa even. Take the Bourbons, the Stuarts, the Romanovs, families whose names were once carved into banners, only to find themselves quietly evicted, relocated to the same coastal towns in France or Italy, sipping bitter coffee under the same sad sun. In some cases, the symmetry is too precise to ignore. A king exiled to a Mediterranean island, his descendant, many years later, banished to a different house on the same island. What do these kings think? Walking the same gardens their ancestors once paced in disgrace? Do they feel the weight of repetition? Or does the familiarity offer comfort? Sometimes the locations themselves become mythic. Exile islands where monarchs go to vanish. Coastal cities that seem always to have a spare room for a deposed sovereign. It's a reminder that royalty, for all its grandeur, often ends in repetition, not in triumph, but in relocation. And when history sends a king to the same exile as his ancestor, it feels less like punishment and more like choreography. And sometimes even death follows the same choreography, returning to the same exact place. 26. Same place of death. Kings may roam vast empires, but many of them die in familiar rooms, palaces they were born in, castles they fought for. And now and then, a chilling pattern emerges. Two monarchs from the same family line dying in the same place, separated not just by years, but by entire epochs. It's easy to brush off. Monarchs die in palaces, and palaces by nature are few and fixed. But some of these repetitions stretch the limits of coincidence. A king dying in a particular castle in the 13th century. Another king, same family, same title, dying in that same room 400 years later. Not in battle, not in exile, but in a familiar bed, in a building that itself seems to bear witness. Even stranger are the emotional patterns. A monarch falls ill at court. He refuses to be moved, saying he wants to die like his ancestor did in the old wing. No one thinks much of it, until historians compare the records and realize the death dates are eerily close and the location nearly identical. It happens often enough to raise questions. Were they inspired by legacy, or does the place itself exert a quiet gravitational pull? Is there something about certain walls that makes them the end point for more than one reign? In some cultures, dying in the same place as one's forebears is considered honorable. In others, ominous. Either way, the location becomes more than geography. It becomes a footnote in a royal obituary that links generations together in death. And sometimes it's not just death that repeats. Sometimes it's a moment stranger still, when a monarch stares into his own face. 27. The king who met his lookalike. Royalty is obsessed with bloodlines, with uniqueness. You are not just anyone, you are the one born under the right star, in the right bed, at the right time. But occasionally the illusion fractures. A king meets someone who looks exactly like him. Not similar, not cousin-level resemblance, a double. The story of the Italian king Umberto is the most famous, but it's not the only one. In other countries and eras, monarchs have reportedly encountered their own doppelgangers. Peasants, soldiers, shopkeepers, even criminals, whose faces mirrored theirs so closely it sparked unrest. The sight of a royal double could cause panic. It hinted at instability, at the notion that royalty might not be chosen by divine fate, but randomly born, replaceable. And in societies where monarchs were believed to rule by divine right, the existence of a lookalike wasn't just awkward, it was threatening. In some cases, the double was used. An ill king sent his twin in appearance to attend court functions. A ruler under threat switched places with a loyal subject who shared his face. These swaps are often whispered, rarely confirmed, but they show up too often in records to dismiss entirely. Even more unsettling, sometimes it's not the king who sees his double, but the public. Two men glimpsed in the same town, both claiming royal identity. One ends up imprisoned, the other crowned, and in certain dynasties this phenomenon recurs. A monarch meets a double. Decades or centuries later, another ruler from the same house does too, as if the bloodline itself carries not just traits, but reflections. What does it mean to see your own face on another body? What happens when that face survives longer than yours? Sometimes the answer lies in paint, not mirrors. 28. Royal portrait alignments. Portraits are supposed to be timeless. They freeze royalty in their finest hour, regal, poised, and impossibly well-dressed. But now and then you'll find two portraits from different centuries and swear they're of the same person. Not just similar styling, not just inherited cheekbones, identical expressions, identical posture, identical mood. One from the 17th century, the other from the 20th, painted by different hands, in different styles, yet echoing each other so precisely it seems intentional. Historians debate whether these are coincidences or carefully curated tributes. Perhaps a later monarch wanted to be seen as the spiritual successor to a storied predecessor. Or perhaps the court artist copied the earlier portrait to invoke continuity. But sometimes there's no explanation. A minor royal with no known link to a past king ends up with a painting that matches an old portrait in uncanny ways, down to the direction of the gaze, the tilt of the hand, the folds of fabric. It doesn't feel like tribute, it feels like déjà vu, and occasionally the resemblance crosses family lines. A Habsburg princess painted in 1760 looks startlingly like a Windsor duchess painted 2 centuries later. Same pale gaze, same ghost of a smile, different canvases, same face. Is it just selective memory? The human mind drawing connections where none exist? Or is something older at work? Some silent compulsion in royal portraiture to return to the same archetype again and again? Because when royalty repeats itself in paint, it's not just about ego. It's about memory, about legacy, and about the unsettling idea that some faces, like some fates, are simply destined to return. 29. Same calendar date for rival deaths. It's one thing for a king to die, it's quite another for his lifelong rival to follow, not in circumstance, not even in cause, but in date. History offers us more than a few cases where two rival monarchs, often locked in years of conflict or political opposition, die on the same day of the year. Not the same year, that would be too cinematic, but the exact same day and month, sometimes decades apart, sometimes generations. A calendar overlap that turns personal vendetta into historical rhyme. These were men whose lives were defined in opposition. One built a navy to defend against the other. One enforced laws that undermined the other's power. They wrote speeches against each other, marched armies toward each other. Their portraits faced opposite directions in enemy propaganda. And then, at the end of it all, same death date. One dies on, say, March the 3rd. Years or decades later, the rival meets death on that same date. No connection, no plotted irony, just a quiet, cruel echo. It's not always discovered right away. A court archivist notes it in passing. Curious, same date as the old king. But it sticks, the kind of detail you can't unknow, especially if the death was unexpected or shared a certain tone. Illness, defeat, public weariness. The irony is sharp, but subtle. The odds are low. There are 365 days in a year and thousands of rivalries in royal history. But these cases persist, sometimes noted in private letters, other times chalked up to divine justice or cosmic balance. In the public's memory, it often becomes poetic. They lived to undo each other, people say, and now they're linked forever. And if fate likes to match rivals in death, it has an even darker sense of humor when it targets dynasties across generations, assassinations staged centuries apart by nobles with the same last name. 30. Royal fates mirrored across generations. Royalty may believe in divine right, but dynasties are more like loops, especially when they begin to rhyme across the centuries in blood and betrayal. Picture a king in the 15th century, popular, powerful, but not invincible. His death comes suddenly, assassination by a group of nobles, one of whom shares his blood. The court reels, the country fractures, a name is stained forever. Now scroll forward 200 years. A descendant of that same king, perhaps distantly removed but still tied to the family line, finds himself surrounded by whispers, plots, tensions. He dies too, unexpectedly. And when the culprits are unmasked, one of them descends from the very same noble house that helped kill the original monarch. Same dynasty, same betrayal, same noble name. This isn't just myth-making. You'll find examples where the official records connect the dots, sometimes even mentioning the old event. Uncomfortably similar to the fate of His Majesty Edward, a court clerk might write, before quickly moving on. The mirroring isn't always perfect. Sometimes it's reversed. In one generation, the king is assassinated. In the next, it's the noble who falls. But the names remain, the roles rotate, and somewhere in the margins of the royal family tree, a pattern is carved. There's an old superstition in some royal courts: never trust a family that's brought down a king. Even generations later, their name still carries weight and perhaps unfinished business. And if conspiracies can echo, so can disaster, not just in bloodlines, but in buildings, especially when fire returns to the same doorsteps. 31. Burned palaces, same day. Palaces are supposed to last forever. Built from marble, guarded by gold, watched over by history itself. But fire doesn't care about architecture or ancestry, and sometimes it seems to care very much about the calendar. There are multiple cases, documented and whispered, of royal palaces burning down on the exact same day of the year, decades or even centuries apart. Different palaces, same royal house, same date, same flames. Take one such palace, once the seat of royal power, later a ceremonial residence. It burns on August the 12th. The court blames a kitchen mishap or faulty wiring or an unattended candle. The rebuilding begins. The date is mourned, then quietly filed away. Then, nearly a century later, another fire breaks out in a different palace, but under the same crown. The date? August the 12th. Even more chilling, both fires begin in eerily similar locations, near kitchens or private chapels or the servants' quarters. The similarities are enough that modern investigators begin to cross-reference logs from the original disaster. Not because they believe in curses, but because the pattern demands attention. Some call it superstition, others call it historical coincidence. But inside palace walls, certain dates become taboo. Staff are cautious, events are rescheduled. On some anniversaries, candles are banned altogether, and the public, of course, loves it. They whisper about fire spirits, about cursed days, about monarchs who built too high, too proud, only to have fate light a match once more. It's not proof of anything, except that time, like fire, tends to repeat itself in patterns, especially when those patterns carry the scent of smoke and legacy. And when names burn along with palaces, some never return, but some do. 32. Cursed name returns. In royal history, names are everything. A name can conjure victory, claim legacy, or, if history went poorly, become a quiet scandal everyone avoids at christenings. Monarchies often drop names like bad investments after a disastrous reign. A monarch dies in disgrace, and the name vanishes from royal circulation like an out-of-print coin. But sometimes it comes back, and when it does, things get strange. Take a monarch named, say, Richard. His reign ends in chaos. Perhaps he's overthrown, perhaps accused of tyranny, perhaps simply unlucky. The name becomes poison, unspoken in court, brushed over in official documents, buried in the middle of dynastic charts. For generations, it disappears from royal nurseries. No prince is given that name, no chapel echoes it at baptism. But then, centuries later, a royal couple brings it back. Richard, they say proudly, maybe invoking family pride, or simply liking the way it sounds. And things begin to wobble again. The newly named monarch or heir, despite the fresh start, often stumbles into eerie parallels. Political unrest, unfavourable public sentiment, personal misfortune, not in identical form, but in tone. The echo is felt more than proven. And those who remember history start whispering that the name might have brought the curse with it. This isn't isolated. Several monarchies, British, French, Spanish, have had names vanish and then return with problematic results. It's as though history doesn't forget. It just waits. Was the name cursed? Not literally, but symbolically it becomes a flag, waving over past disasters. A name carries expectations, baggage, ghosts, and if you invoke a ghost, you might have to live with it. Of course, not every revival ends in ruin, but the pattern is hard to ignore. The name returns. So does the tension, because in monarchy, some names were buried for a reason, and some were better left there. But sometimes fate doesn't just haunt a name, it crosses social lines entirely. From thrones to rivers, from royalty to the crowd. 33. Monarch and subject shared fate. Royalty is built on distance. The throne sits high, the people far below. But sometimes fate doesn't seem to care about hierarchy. Sometimes a king and a commoner, two people from opposite ends of the world's ladder, end up with eerily matching ends. Same place, same method, same date. Take a monarch who dies under unusual circumstances, say drowning in a specific river. Tragic, certainly, but not in itself supernatural. Then, decades or centuries later, another person dies the same way, on the same date, in the same river. The difference? This one isn't royal. He's a scholar, a soldier, a poet, a farmer. Just someone with no throne, but an uncanny echo of the royal death that came before. The event doesn't usually make front-page news. It's the kind of odd footnote that slips into the back of local papers or into parish records. Remarkably, the death occurred on the anniversary of King X's fatal accident, someone might note, and then forget. But when historians dig deeper, they find more examples. Monarch and subject, different centuries, same fate, same date, sometimes even same age. It's not about conspiracy. There's no suggestion that the subject was targeted, but the symmetry unsettles. It collapses the royal divide. It suggests that fate or history or something stranger draws lines across classes that we pretend are unbreakable. Some royal archivists avoid making note of these parallels. Others highlight them quietly as signs that monarchy, for all its rituals, isn't immune to the randomness of time. Or maybe it's not random at all. Maybe the monarch's death writes a story that the world quietly finishes years later through someone else. Because when patterns spill outside the palace gates, they stop being royal mysteries and start becoming human ones. And sometimes those patterns crash weddings instead of funerals. 34. Royal weddings and catastrophes. A royal wedding is meant to be the happiest page in a monarchy's chapter. Trumpets, processions, gowns that cost more than small nations, hope, renewal, and endless speculation about flower arrangements. But sometimes, uncannily, these weddings come marked by disaster. It could be a natural event, a storm tearing through the city as vows are exchanged, a political crisis erupting during the banquet, a tragic accident en route to the ceremony. But the strangest part is not the disaster, it's the date, because it's not just one wedding that suffers. The same calendar date, sometimes generations later, plays host to another royal wedding and another unexpected catastrophe. Consider this: a princess marries on June 17th. On that very day, a flood hits the capital. The event is overshadowed. Rumors swirl. Years pass. Then another couple chooses June 17th for their royal ceremony, unaware perhaps or dismissive of the earlier omen. And once again, misfortune crashes the party. Coincidence? Possibly, but the repetition becomes part of the law. That cursed date is quietly noted, avoided in future scheduling, or sometimes brazenly reused, an act of defiance or historical amnesia. In some cases, the disasters mirror each other. Similar weather, similar timing, a late arrival, a collapsed stage, a national emergency breaking just as the couple says, "I do." Royal historians have compiled lists of these unlucky dates, and while the patterns aren't always neat, they're persistent. Enough that planners begin to avoid certain weekends, enough that some whisper it's not just bad luck, but a sign that certain dates carry too much memory. After all, royal weddings aren't just about love, they're about symbolism, and symbols have long memories, especially when they're dressed in white, followed by clouds, because even the sunniest coronation can end in shadow, especially when the stars above decide to join the guest list. 35. Royal deaths and solar eclipses. A monarch dies. The court mourns, the flags drop, the bells toll, and somewhere overhead, the sky goes dark. Not metaphorically, literally. A solar eclipse right on schedule, or, depending on who you ask, not scheduled at all. This coincidence, the alignment of death and darkness, is one of the oldest and most unsettling motifs in royal folklore. And it's not just poetic framing. In multiple historical cases, a royal death has occurred within hours, sometimes minutes, of a visible solar eclipse. Take ancient records from the East, emperors whose deaths coincided with the sudden shadowing of the sun. Their astronomers saw it as divine judgment, a literal dimming of heavenly approval. In Europe, too, there are whispers of kings whose final breath came as the light drained from the sky. No planned symbolism, no theatrical timing, just coincidence, or something that pretends not to be. And like all good royal patterns, it doesn't just happen once. Centuries later, another monarch dies under an eclipsed sky. The dates are unrelated, the dynasties different, the death causes varied, but the timing, uncanny. Some scientists would gently remind us that eclipses are predictable. The moon doesn't care who's ruling, but try telling that to a people who just lost their king and saw the sun vanish in the same afternoon. Good luck writing that off as atmospheric coincidence. And the strangest echoes, when the monarch who dies during an eclipse is a direct descendant of one who also died during an earlier one. Different centuries, same bloodline, same celestial curtain call. Even today, in the age of rational explanation, eclipse calendars and royal schedules are still cross-checked. Not officially, of course, just quietly, just in case, because when the sun disappears at the same moment the crown falls, nobody really wants to call it random. But sometimes the repetition isn't in the sky, it's inside the body. When two monarchs, linked by name, die of the same rare affliction, long after medicine should have intervened. 36. Same name, same illness. Some royal names are practically immortal. George, Henry, Elizabeth, endlessly repeated like mantras carved into marble. But occasionally, that repetition carries something more than tradition. Sometimes it carries death. Throughout history, there have been cases where two monarchs, separated by generations but sharing the same name, die of the same rare disease. And not something expected, like age or injury. We're talking illnesses uncommon even in their own time. The kind that turn doctors into historians, flipping through dusty journals looking for a match. Imagine a King Charles dying of a mysterious neurological disorder in the 17th century. Fast forward to the 19th, and another Charles, different man, same throne, same diagnosis. Despite medical advances, despite time itself, the disease returns with surgical precision. Same symptoms, same decline, same outcome. Coincidence? Maybe, but it happens enough to notice. Sometimes these names are considered unlucky after the second event. The name gets shelved quietly. No more Charleses or Edwards or Fredericks, at least not for a while. It's as if the name itself became contaminated. And it's not just names. These monarchs sometimes share eerily similar life paths. Crowned at the same age, ruled for the same duration, even involved in the same kind of political struggle. Their reigns read like mirrored documents, ending in identical margins. Cause of death, unexplainable. In one particularly odd case, royal physicians revisiting old coronation records noted that the two monarchs had even had similar coronation diets. Not identical, but close. Enough to make someone wonder, were these inherited fates or merely history playing its usual tricks? Either way, the lesson seems clear. In a royal family, a name is never just a name. It's a pattern, a prophecy, a possibility. And some patterns aren't just about rulers. Sometimes it's the women behind the throne, queen regents, stepping in again and again. 37. The reappearing queen regent. The role of a queen regent is supposed to be temporary, a pause in the great male succession machine. The king dies or disappears, the heir is too young, and suddenly the mother, aunt, or widow steps forward. Not to rule forever, just to hold the line, a placeholder in pearls. But in some dynasties, these queen regents keep showing up, not once, not twice, over and over, as if the throne, when left vulnerable, instinctively calls the same kind of woman to fill the gap. Take a royal house where, in the 1500s, a dowager queen takes power for her underage son. She rules competently, maybe even brilliantly, though court historians prefer to call her diplomatic. Then, a century or two later, another young king is crowned too soon, and once again, a female relative steps in. Her name, strikingly similar, her manner, identical. Even her court policies echo those of her regency predecessor. It starts to feel less like coincidence and more like choreography. These women aren't always lauded in their time. Some are accused of overstepping, of grasping too much power. Others are quietly praised as saviors. But the pattern remains. The monarchy falters, and a woman rises, with a surname, temperament, or political style eerily reminiscent of the last time this happened. Even more curious, these regents are sometimes born on the same day, or ascend to power at the same age. In at least 2 cases, they even issued identical reforms, not inspired by each other, separated by centuries, just aligned. It's tempting to romanticize it. A dynasty's hidden strength, repeating like a secret code, but it also underscores monarchy's fragility. That, in times of crisis, the crown often ends up in the hands of someone it wasn't designed for, but someone who wears it better than expected. And if queen regents return like echoes, so do their tragedies, especially when childbirth becomes destiny and death. 38. Royal deaths in childbirth. Name echo. Childbirth was once the most dangerous duty a royal woman could perform. More than diplomacy, more than court politics, more than any whispered scandal, it was labor that turned queens into martyrs. Yet in some royal lineages, the tragedy doesn't end with a single queen's death. It circles back. Centuries later, another woman bearing the same name, often in the same role, dies the same way. And sometimes it's not just the manner of death that repeats, but the name of the child, too. It begins with a queen, young and hopeful, carrying an heir. The court prepares for celebration. A prince or princess is born, and then everything falls silent. The queen doesn't recover. Her name is etched in sorrow. Her child, perhaps named after a grandparent, a saint, or even herself, survives or doesn't. Either way, the story becomes royal folklore. Fast forward a century or 2. Another queen enters labor. Her name? The same. Her child's name? Unsettlingly familiar. No one remarks on it publicly. Too morbid, but some remember. And when the outcome is identical, the echo becomes a ghost story. Historians may say it's just statistical misfortune. After all, childbirth complications were once tragically common, but the specificity of the pattern, same queen name, same child's name, same fatal result, strains coincidence. It reads like a script being replayed, a dynasty looping through its own trauma. In some families, the name of the first queen becomes taboo. No future daughters bear it. In others, it's reclaimed, a tribute, a sign of defiance. But each time it's spoken again, there's a shadow behind it, a memory waiting in the delivery room. Because in royal lines, the past is never really past, especially when it chooses to arrive and exit the same way. And if some royal children are born into tragedy, others find themselves turned against the very crown that created them. 39. Monarch's child becomes enemy king. It's a betrayal that feels Shakespearean, because it is. A king raises a child under his roof within the gilded corridors of power. The child learns diplomacy, command, bloodline pride, and then, somewhere along the line, that child becomes a king, not in support of the parent but in rebellion. A monarch's own son or grandson crowned as enemy. This doesn't happen often, but when it does, it leaves scorch marks on history. In one century, a disinherited son flees the court, gathers allies, and takes up arms against his father's realm. In another, a cousin raised in the palace ends up ruling a rival territory, not through war, but through a marriage, a coup, or sheer twist of succession. Suddenly, the family tree has 2 crowns on opposite branches, both claiming legitimacy, both glaring across borders, and it gets stranger. Centuries later, the same pattern emerges in the same dynasty. A royal child, cut out of succession or pushed to the fringes, ends up ascending to a throne in opposition. Different circumstances, different era, same betrayal by blood. Sometimes the new monarch even uses the same symbols, same titles, same regnal number, as if trying to overwrite the legacy of the father or uncle he once served. The act isn't just political, it's personal. A child turning the crown upside down, the pattern becomes almost mechanical. A monarch loses control of a branch of their family, and that branch grows into a rival kingdom. Time passes, peace returns, and then, generations later, it happens again. Royal bloodlines are long, but not always loyal. And when children rise to wear crowns that oppose their kin, It reveals monarchy's deepest flaw, that power, once divided, never forgets where it came from, especially when revolutions have a habit of keeping the same calendar. 40. Repeated revolutions on anniversary. The fall of a crown is rarely subtle. Revolutions are loud, public, and unforgettable until they're forgotten. Then one day they return, and sometimes they do so on the exact same date. There are multiple recorded cases of palace coups, constitutional crises, or full-blown revolutions breaking out on the anniversary of earlier royal overthrows. Different leaders, different causes, same day, as if the calendar itself demands another act in the same tragic play. Picture this: a monarch is forced to abdicate on July the 14th. The people cheer, the court flees, statues fall, a national holiday is born. A century later, the country is stable again. The monarchy, or its modern equivalent, persists. And then, on July 14th once more, a government collapses, or a palace is stormed, or a descendant of that same royal house is removed from power. Historians might argue that dates are symbolic, and revolutionaries often choose them for maximum impact. That's fair. Some uprisings are timed as deliberate echoes, but not all. In many cases, the alignment is accidental. Discontent brews, protests build, and the eruption just so happens to fall on the date of an earlier upheaval. It's in those moments that the echo becomes eerie. Courts often fear anniversaries. Some monarchs have quietly suspended public appearances on the anniversary of past downfalls, not because they believe in superstition, but because history has a way of returning. And when revolution arrives wearing the same date as its last appearance, it doesn't feel like coincidence. It feels like revenge with a sense of timekeeping, because in the world of crowns and guillotines, the most dangerous day of the year is the one that's already marked. 41. Two queens dying same day. In royal history, death is always a spectacle, a moment preserved in ceremony, procession, and polished language. But when two queens, separated by years or even centuries, die on the exact same calendar day, it stops feeling ceremonial and starts feeling conspiratorial. It's not just that both were queens, it's that their deaths occurred on the same date, say January the 28th, one in a palace, the other in exile or across the sea. Different queens, different lives, but eerily synchronized in their exits. This phenomenon doesn't appear frequently, but it's persistent enough to have entered royal lore. A queen consort of England dies during winter illness. 2 centuries later, a queen regnant, perhaps from the same house or a closely related dynasty, passes on the same day. No connection in their reigns, no overlapping politics, just that one cold date tying them together. What makes it uncanny is how these shared death dates are often not discovered until long after the fact. A historian leafing through dusty records notices the date. The court biographer pauses mid-sentence. The realization sinks in. She died on the same day as, and just like that, history gains another echo. In some cases, these dates become sacred or avoided. Commemorations held for one queen now carry the shadow of another. The day becomes less about mourning a single life and more about recognizing a pattern no one quite understands. It invites speculation, of course. Were they astrologically aligned? Were their lives shaped by similar constraints, leading to similar ends at similar times of year? Or is this just history doing what it does best, repeating itself without explanation? Whatever the cause, the result remains. 2 queens, same crown, same calendar, same final page. And while some queens die on the same day, others live to see their jubilees celebrated with fanfare, only for disaster to arrive dressed for the party. 42. Royal Jubilee, same year as disaster jubilees are meant to be triumphs. The anniversary of a reign is a rare thing in monarchy. The sovereign still living, the crown still intact, the people ostensibly still loyal. But now and then, a jubilee year turns sour. A fire, a riot, a war, a scandal, something rotten seeping into the golden frame of the celebration. Once is unfortunate, twice is unnerving, but when it happens again and again in the same dynasty, it starts to feel deliberate. Take a monarch who celebrates a silver jubilee in 1875. The empire shines, the press writes gushing tributes, and then, 3 months later, a national disaster strikes. The court spins, downplays, recovers. Fast forward, another monarch from the same lineage marks a golden jubilee in the 20th century. Same pomp, same mood, and again, disaster. Maybe a political assassination, or an international crisis, or a domestic catastrophe so grim it overshadows the jubilee itself. And then a third time, a modern ruler, a diamond jubilee, new century, new monarchy, but the same eerie script. Joy at the start of the year, crisis before its end. The disasters don't have to be connected. In fact, it's stranger when they're not. When it's not sabotage or mismanagement, but sheer historical symmetry. Some palace staff grow quietly wary of Jubilee planning. Too much optimism, they say, tempts fate. Royal astrologers, where they still exist, are consulted with more urgency. The date of the celebration is weighed against past calamities, yet no one ever officially admits concern. But inside the palace walls, there's an unspoken truth. Jubilee years seem to carry a double edge. Long reigns are rare, and those who live to see them often live to see something else. Even stranger is when the echoes aren't in events, but in the body. A birthmark, a deformity, a sign passed down like a prophecy. 43. Royal child with unusual birthmark. Royal infants are usually described with cautious optimism. Healthy, pink-cheeked, a good cry. But every so often, a child is born with something extra, a distinctive birthmark, a curious blemish, a feature that sets them apart from the moment they're held up to the court. In most cases, it's dismissed. A mark of beauty, some say. A blessing, say others. But sometimes that same mark appears again, not in the same child, but in a descendant, generations later. Same shape, same placement, same whisper of fate. Imagine a prince born in the 17th century with a crescent-shaped mark on his left shoulder. The court physician notes it. The queen calls it a sign. It becomes part of his legend, even if he dies young. Then, over 200 years later, another royal child, this time far removed on the family tree, is born with a similar mark in the same spot. The connection isn't immediate, but eventually someone compares christening records. The detail surfaces. The mark has returned. Doctors today would call it coincidence, genetic recurrence, a quirk of biology. But in royal history, symbols matter more than science. And when a monarch's mark returns generations later, it isn't just a medical curiosity. It becomes myth. Some families go silent on it. Others lean in. The mark is hidden or displayed, depending on the climate of superstition. In some tales, the child with the mark is believed destined for greatness. In others, for tragedy. Either way, the narrative attaches like ivy, slowly growing, impossible to separate. And while moles and scars are common, these stories persist because of the symmetry, the improbability, the sense that history doesn't just live in palaces or books, but occasionally beneath the skin. 44. 2 monarchs abdicate on same date. Abdication is monarchy's emergency exit, the moment a ruler, by will or force, steps down from the throne. It's dramatic, it's rare, and for a system built on continuity, it's slightly scandalous. But when it happens twice, in the same monarchy, on the same date, separated by centuries, it stops being scandal and starts being something stranger. Picture this. A king abdicates on October 10th. The court reels, the public gasps, the papers scream. He goes quietly into exile or semi-retirement, depending on the century. His name lives on in footnotes, and the date becomes one of quiet shame. Then, generations later, long after the memory has faded, another monarch from the same bloodline abdicates, also on October 10th. The second ruler likely didn't plan it that way. In many cases, the date is dictated by crisis. constitutional breakdown, personal scandal, public revolt. The court scrambles, lawyers draft documents, and the pen meets paper. Only later does someone realize this happened before, on this exact day. It's a hard thing to explain. Abdication is not routine. There are entire monarchies that have never experienced it. For it to happen twice in the same house, on the same date, suggests more than chance. It suggests some kind of invisible pressure point in the royal calendar. Some say it's psychological, that institutions carry hidden rhythms, that the weight of history bears down harder on certain days. Others chalk it up to cosmic symmetry. Monarchs ruled by the same stars, pushed to the same conclusion. Either way, the date is now marked, quietly, sometimes superstitiously. If another monarch reigns into October, advisors get nervous. History might not repeat, but it does seem to like anniversaries. And if abdications echo through the calendar, what happens when even coronation dates start speaking in numbers? 45. Names matching coronation dates. Royalty loves symbolism, and nothing says destiny like numbers lining up with names. But occasionally, the match is too perfect. A monarch named Edward IV crowned on April the 4th, a King Louis IX rising to power on September the 9th. Numbers matching both regnal order and date, so precise they sound fictional. These aren't fictions, they're footnotes in real historical records, often shrugged off as coincidence. But it's the kind of coincidence that feels staged. A name, a number, and a coronation date all falling into eerie alignment, as if fate were signing its name on the paperwork too. Most of these alignments go unnoticed at first. After all, coronations are complex productions, planned months in advance, driven by availability, weather, politics, and public ceremony. But once the date is set, the number is inked in. And only later does someone say, "Isn't it strange? Edward IV, crowned on 4/4. Sometimes the alignment feels chosen, a deliberate nod to legacy. Other times it feels accidental, but the psychological effect is undeniable. The public eats it up. The press runs headlines. A sign of royal luck, they write. Numerology and nobility collide. Of course, the danger with perfect symmetry is expectation. A monarch crowned on a date that matches his name might be seen as chosen until his reign falters. Then the date becomes ironic. He had the right number, they'll say, just not the right reign. Still, these coronation coincidences tend to stick in the mind. They're neat, memorable, the sort of thing history enjoys packaging, especially in royal families obsessed with legacy. But not all alignments are symbolic. Some are startling, like a monarch sharing a birthday with a subject who would change history. 46. Monarch and scholar share birth date. Most kings are born surrounded by ceremony. Scholars, not so much. One enters the world to church bells and declarations, the other to little fanfare, unless he's lucky. But sometimes fate pairs them in secret, giving them the same birthday, the same calendar moment. One to rule, one to think. In several instances, a reigning monarch and a brilliant thinker from his realm share not only an era but a date of birth, day and month. Different years, usually, but the alignment is enough to be noticed, especially when the scholar ends up defining part of that king's reign. Imagine a ruler born on February 22nd. A mathematician is born on the same day, 20 years later. That mathematician eventually revolutionizes military strategy, the same strategy the king uses in war. Or a philosopher, born on the king's birthday, grows to criticize the very foundation of monarchy. The date becomes a mirror, one face royal, one rebellious. Some kings embraced the coincidence. Letters were exchanged, patronage offered. "We share a day," they'd write, as if that fact alone made them kindred. Others ignored it, perhaps unsettled by the idea that their birthday wasn't entirely their own. In at least one documented case, the king and the scholar not only shared a birthday, but died within a month of each other, as if their lives had been set to the same internal clock. Astrologers, of course, delighted in these findings. They'd chart horoscopes, compare charts, declare shared destinies. The modern mind scoffs, but the alignments still make you pause. Because in a world that divides people by birthright, nothing levels the field quite like a shared origin point. One born to rule, one born to question, and sometimes one born just as the other dies, as if history must replace itself, one heartbeat at a time. 47. Royal child born after death of predecessor. Succession is supposed to be seamless. One monarch dies, another steps in, but occasionally a strange twist interrupts the rhythm. A child is born just after a predecessor dies, not years later, not months, days, sometimes even hours. And when this happens more than once in the same royal house, it starts to feel less like coincidence and more like choreography. Imagine a monarch dying in early spring. The court is cloaked in mourning, bells toll, portraits are veiled. Then, within days, a royal infant arrives. A successor in name only, far too young to understand the throne, yet born with the uncanny timing of someone ushered in to fill a cosmic vacancy. The symbolism is irresistible. Death followed by life. The last breath of one ruler answered by the first cry of the next. Historians typically note the proximity with a cautious line, born shortly after the death of, but they don't often comment on the emotional resonance, the sense of replacement, of a soul handed off, like a relay baton passed between centuries. And it doesn't happen just once. Several royal lineages record similar sequences, one monarch's death paired eerily with the arrival of another royal child, sometimes even a future monarch. The calendar feels suspicious, too neat. In some cultures, this kind of timing is interpreted as reincarnation, in others as divine approval. But regardless of belief, the emotional impact is the same, grief giving way to hope. Mourning robes swapped for christening gowns, a crown passed before it even has a head to sit on. It raises a philosophical question monarchy never quite answers. Is the crown inherited or assigned? And if time really does repeat itself in royal bloodlines, perhaps even the grave has a sense of symmetry. Just ask the tombstones. 48. Same grave monument, date. In the hushed stillness of royal tombs, patterns whisper where no voices remain. Among stone effigies and engraved marble, there are dates of death etched with authority, and every so often, two monarchs, far removed by time, end up sharing the same one. Not the year, that would be too neat, but the day and month, yes, repeated, embedded in two separate monuments centuries apart, is the same cold declaration. Departed this life the 12th day of May. It could be accident. There are, after all, only so many days in a year, but when it happens in the same dynasty, or in connected dynasties with interwoven bloodlines, it begins to feel like more than chance, especially when the monarchs shared similar fates, or died at similar ages, or in the same location. In some cases, the tombs are in entirely different countries. Visitors to one royal chapel might pause to read the date on a king's final stone. Then, in another city, in another royal crypt, the same date reappears. No connection announced, just a quiet echo chiseled in Latin. The most unnerving examples involve tombs in the same building. Imagine walking down the aisle of a royal burial chamber and seeing two monarchs, 5 centuries apart, remembered on the same day. A monarch and his great-great-granddaughter, perhaps, or a king and his dynastic rival, both immortalized in stone with the same death date. Some courtiers took this as an omen, others ignored it. But the stonemasons, they remembered. After all, they carved both dates. Their hands repeated what history already knew. And as we trace these lines in marble, we're forced to ask, does legacy follow the living, or does it sleep beneath them, waiting? And what if even mistakes, misrecorded facts, historical typos, aren't random either? 49. Royal mistakes in genealogies. Echo. Royal genealogies are supposed to be pristine, carefully ordered, beautifully bound, meticulously cross-checked by generations of scholars. After all, these charts don't just trace family trees, they trace legitimacy itself. But every now and then, a mistake slips in, a wrong date, a confused name, a misattributed title, and somehow that exact same error appears again centuries later. Take one such mistake. A chronicler in the 1300s misrecords the start of a monarch's reign by several months. Perhaps a coronation was delayed or a regnal year miscounted. The error is copied into subsequent documents, spreading quietly like ink through parchment. Then, 200 years later, another chronicler, supposedly working independently, makes the same mistake for a different king of the same name. Same error, same dynasty. No apparent reason. These aren't grand conspiracies. They're small, irritating anomalies. But the repetition feels too strange to ignore, especially when these mirrored mistakes involve monarchs with similar reputations, both weak, both war-torn, or both remembered poorly. It's as if even the errors carry a kind of legacy. In some royal records, misdated deaths appear more than once. A queen is said to have died in 1453, though she lived until 1455. That same mistaken year appears in a later genealogy, now assigned to a different queen, one with a similar title and equally misunderstood. Historians now have digital archives, cross-referenced with satellite precision, but older records still echo with these repeating inaccuracies, like ghost typos looping through the corridors of dynastic memory. Is it simply laziness? Coincidence? Or is there something deeper at work, an invisible hand reshaping the narrative, nudging certain details back into place, even when they don't belong there? In royal history, even the mistakes may be deliberate, or worse, remembered. 50. Coincidental rival death match history has a sense of humour, albeit a bleak one. It enjoys symmetry, especially when it can arrange for two enemies to exit the stage in matching fashion, even when they never shared a stage at all. Enter the phenomenon of the rival death match. Two monarchs, separated by time, dynasty, or geography, who die in the same way, often in bizarrely specific circumstances, and sometimes on the very same date of the calendar year. It's one thing for two kings to fall in battle. That's practically expected. But when two rival kings, one from the 13th century, the other from the 19th, both die from, say, a fall from a horse on August 17th, that's no longer common. That's suspicious. These aren't just repeated fates, they're repeated narratives. In one case, a monarch dies during a ceremonial parade. A century later, his dynastic rival suffers a fatal accident in a similar public procession. Both considered charismatic, both known for reform, both gone in an instant before the crown could catch its breath. Sometimes the connection only becomes visible in hindsight. A historian draws the lines between centuries and gasps. The same date, the same method, the same public reaction, shock, mourning, national disruption. It's not always deliberate. In fact, it's rarely deliberate, but it plays out like a well-rehearsed drama. And sometimes it's even stranger. Neither king knew of the other, but their nations were historically entangled. Their names were paired in treaties, wars, marriages, and now apparently in death. The pattern might not mean anything, but the repetition sticks, like a signature at the end of a royal chapter. Two rulers, two reigns, same fall, and if kings can die the same way, why not return the same name after a long and suspicious pause? 51. Royal name reintroduced after long gap. There are royal names that burn too brightly and burn out. After one spectacularly ill-fated reign, a name disappears from royal nurseries for generations. It's not banned officially. It's simply not spoken, avoided, left to moulder in the footnotes of dynasty charts. But history, with its infinite patience, loves a comeback. Enter the reintroduction, centuries pass, memories fade, and one day a new heir is christened with that name. The cursed one, the forgotten one. The name last worn by a monarch who died too soon, or ruled too poorly, or left the crown in shambles. At first it seems innocent. A tribute, perhaps, a nod to tradition, but soon the echo grows louder. The new prince or king begins to resemble his namesake, not necessarily in looks, but in path, in policy, in tragedy, born on a similar day, ascended at a similar age, died at a familiar time. This pattern is seen in more than one royal house, a King Richard followed by no other Richards for centuries until the name is revived, and sure enough, the new Richard faces political collapse. A Prince Louis, named long after the guillotine silenced the last Louis, only to find himself presiding over national unrest. Even the royal family's advisors sometimes voice quiet concern. Is this wise, they ask, that name? The answer, almost always, is yes, because history, when it loops, doesn't announce itself. It's only later, when the reign ends or the scandal erupts, that people remember, we've seen this name before. It raises an uncomfortable thought. Are names just names, or are they scripts waiting to be acted again? And sometimes those scripts span more than one crown. Sometimes they strike two kingdoms at once. 52. Simultaneous deaths in allied dynasties. It's rare enough for one monarch to die, but when two do, on the exact same day, and happen to be related by blood, marriage, or alliance, the coincidence becomes hard to ignore, especially when those two monarchs rule different kingdoms. These aren't assassinations or war casualties, these are natural deaths, often unexpected, happening in different lands, but marked by the same date. October the 9th, April the 14th. Whatever the number, it gets inked into two separate royal histories. Same day, different crowns. Imagine a British king dying in Windsor. On the same day, a cousin, king of a European realm, dies quietly in a distant palace. The correspondence arrives days later, confirming the timing. And suddenly, what was a personal loss becomes a cross-border riddle. Theories abound. Shared genetics, perhaps. Stress, possible, but often the monarchs aren't even old. One might be 72, the other 41. The deaths might be unrelated in cause, but eerily aligned in symbolism, both seen as stabilizers of their nations, both succeeded by younger, unprepared heirs, both marking the end of an era. Sometimes these monarchs had corresponded, shared holidays, attended each other's coronations. Other times, they never met, their bond only visible in genealogical charts. The public often misses the connection, but historians don't, and neither do courtiers, who now read the date with careful memory. For the royal families involved, the grief is doubled, and the coincidence quietly chilling, because it suggests that even across nations, monarchs are not just linked by treaties, but perhaps by something deeper. A timeline they didn't write, but followed nonetheless. And if death can link two kingdoms, so can loss of the crown itself, on the same day, again. 53. Two crowns lost on same date. In monarchies, abdication is the sound of history changing clothes. One ruler leaves, voluntarily or otherwise, and the crown moves, hesitates, or disappears entirely. But every so often, something stranger happens. Two crowns in two different countries fall on the same day of the calendar year. Different monarchs, different nations, same date, not the same event, not a shared war, not a diplomatic treaty, just a chilling coincidence where two separate rulers lose their thrones on, say, November 30th, years or even centuries apart, yet unmistakably synced. It's one thing when dynasties fall in parallel. That's history's usual rhythm, but when two monarchs, linked by blood or marriage or no connection at all, lose their crowns on the same calendar date, it becomes a historical echo. A quiet message etched into the royal ledger. Sometimes the circumstances are eerily similar. One abdicates under political pressure, the other in a constitutional crisis. Both are reluctant, both delay, both sign the final document just before midnight, and the date sticks. It gets published, remembered, repeated. Decades later, when another monarch faces unrest, someone in the archives will glance at the calendar and feel that flicker of recognition. Isn't this the same date King X lost his crown? The sensation isn't just statistical, it's architectural. Monarchies are built on ritual and timing, anniversaries, jubilees, national days. When one of those days becomes haunted by past abdications, it doesn't just unsettle the court, it paralyzes it. The press rarely mentions it. Monarchies prefer to forget their endings. But within royal households, the date is remembered. Perhaps not spoken of openly, but observed with a particular stillness. Because if power can be gained on a date, it seems it can also be taken. And sometimes the date doesn't matter as much as the pattern of loss, especially when crowns fall in the same way, again and again and again.